This week on Quality Digest Live, we'll get a risk management primer. I think that's actually primer for those of you in the U.S. from Tim Lozier of ETQ.
Right. Plus a textbook case of supply chain mismanagement. That more when we come back. Welcome back to Quality Digest Live for September 25th, 2015. QDL is your weekly look at who and what is making the news in the world of quality. I'm Dirk Ducharme, Editor-in-Chief of Quality Digest.
Yes, he is, and I'm Quality Digest publisher Mike Richmond. All right, we got a full show for you today, both in English and American.
Right.
So we're going to dispense with the news, and we're going to jump right into our feature articles of the week. And we're going to start with a piece from Mike MicroRidge titled, "Still Can't Master 5S? Try 1S."
There you go.
That's right. Which
Simplify
ran,
it.
It's right. Cut it down. Which ran in Wednesday's issue of Quality Digest Daily. You can see it right there. Yes, in Wednesday's QDD. Well, Mike MicroRidge, as you'll all know, is a world-renowned trainer, writer, and consultant who specializes in lean and continuous improvement. As such, he understands that for any organization to truly achieve sustained excellence in lean, they need to grasp the big picture. In other words, the principles and the culture that spring from those principles, all of which are absolutely necessary for lean to flourish. Without these, which must be put in place by top management, you should always remember that, the extensive lean toolkit means nothing. I mean, that we know how that goes. I mean, if you don't have your principles and your culture in place, if the broader strategic imperatives of lean aren't there and everything's aligned and people want to have lean work, especially from the top management down, it's not going to work. You can have the greatest tool set in the world,
right.
and you can implement it really well, but it's never going to sustain if you don't have those principles. So that's really what he's saying here. And the principles he's talking about are things like respect for people, commitment to forward-facing and real-time analytics, the ability to see waste, that's a big one, and a commitment to pull systems and flow, and that's just to name a few of them. So they touch on everything that lean needs to do to achieve improvement and to achieve lasting improvement and to sustain itself. Like all lean tools, a properly executed 5S program can be a great asset to an organization, but only if those principles are in place. If 5S is done in a disrespectful way, if it's based on old information, if it's inhibited by flow-choking silos, it's never going to work. And even if you don't have those particular problems, 5S can still trip up on the fifth and the final S, which is sustain. MicroRidge says that certain lean senseis in Japan insisted that 5S practitioners show the discipline to sustain the program in a single area for up to a year or more. Think about that, a year or more, 5S in one area before they move on to other functional areas. I mean, you talk about discipline. I mean, the discipline to do 5S in one area of your shop for a year or more and sustain it. And to keep it going forward before you move on. I mean, that's not how most people do it.
Well,
but
particularly here in the United States, is we want
you give a month, maybe a week, you know? I mean, hey, let's get it done, right? But that's not the way it should be done. So here in this article, MicroRidge says that if you're having trouble with 5S, especially an inability to sustain it, the fifth S, for any period of time, perhaps you need to look at a single S. One that stands for, not one that stands for sort, not one that stands for set in order or shine or standardize, and not even sustain. The single S he's talking about stands for stop. That's right, stop. Rather than continue with a half-hearted 5S program that's almost certainly doomed to failure, MicroRidge suggests that the 5S implementer cease the program and go back to the basics. Examine the root causes of the problem. Consider whether your principles and cultures of the organization are truly aligned with the lean mentality. For instance, ask these questions. Is top management involved? I mean, really involved, right? Is there a batch mindset, even down to the perspective of regularly scheduled spot checks as opposed to continuous trips to the Gemba, the place where the work is really being done? Are departments and silos preventing the sharing of information? That's a big one. You know, you learn something, but if you're siloed, that learning doesn't spread across the entire organization. And then, are people being trained and coached, again, respectfully, you have to respect people, and again, continuously? To get the most out of 5S and to get the most out of lean in general, you must achieve alignment between the principles, the cultures, and the tools, but the tools can only come on board, again, after the first two are deeply rooted. Putting the cart before the horse is going to get you nowhere. And I think that's really the message of the story, is that, you know, it's better to stop It's better to do 1S and stop rather than do 5S haphazardly and not have it sustain and not have it align with what your organizational cultures and values are. If you do that, it's not going to succeed. And before I leave the story, I want to make one other point. Mike MicroRidge, we know him very well. He's a good friend of ours. He really is a gifted instructor of lean theory and practice. And we've mentioned here in the show, he's been on our show many times, and we've partnered with him. Our training arm, 360performancecircle.com, has partnered with Mike to produce a streaming video training series based on lean principles and lean culture, along with the tools such as 5S, Gemba walking, training within industry, and a lot more. So if you're interested in this topic, I really want to encourage you to check out 360performancecircle.com. There's a big link in Mike's article that you can check out. It just says lean right there. And Mike's article right below the video player page. So check it out down there. Click on that or just go over to www.360performancecircle.com and check out what we have to offer there, because it's a really good series, good in-depth series, very beautifully produced by our director, Chris Smith, of course, and I think you'll like it, so check that out.
Yeah, and the nice thing about Mike is he constantly brings up the idea of respect, respect for people. It doesn't do any good to try to do anything that involves getting your employees on board with any idea if you don't expect them as people and also respect their work and the work that they're trying to do for you. So that is one of the main running themes through all of MicroRidge's training, which I really appreciate. I mean, you can never lose sight of that respect for the employee.
And that's the core, that's really one of the cores of the original Toyota production system, was respect for people, because the respect of people's knowledge and ideas and what they bring to the organization in terms of making change, because they're the ones that are at the Gemba doing the work. And when you have that, you have a chance to really succeed if that's part of your culture and that's part of the principles that you bring to your organization. Really important.
Exactly. Okay, well, you know, the idea of risk management has grown quickly in the past 5 to 10 years. I mean, I think we first heard consultants start talking about it, maybe not quite 10 years ago, but maybe 6 or 7 years ago for certain.
Yeah, probably around 2009.
Yeah, Greg Hutchins, I think.
Yep.
But it's particularly come to the fore, the idea of risk-based thinking being included in the latest version of ISO 9001 2015. So the idea is, what kind of came to my mind is, has our idea of risk changed? If it has changed, how has it changed?
Why has it changed?
Why has it changed? And to answer that question and a few more, we have with us Tim Lozier, Director of Marketing for ETQ. Hi, Tim.
Hey guys, how are you?
Yeah, pretty good. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Well, yeah, thanks for having me.
As I said, I think traditionally when people considered risk, it was the risk of making or shipping a defective product. You know, so it was kind of very product oriented. But I think today's concept of risk is much broader than that. Is that right? And if so, can you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, so if you think about it, we live in a much more complex marketplace. There's, global organizations, there's mergers and acquisitions, there's more moving pieces than ever before, and product life cycles that are much faster, to the tune of months versus years. And so in all this speed and rapid pace of business, we're expected to keep quality and compliance, and we're expected to make sure we're benchmarking our compliance at every step. And so what happens is we need to find a way to really enroll the entire organization in compliance. And you look at the silo of compliance, you look at the silo of quality. Not everybody speaks quality, not everybody speaks that language, but everybody speaks risk. Risk is a universal language, it's a universal translator for all the operational areas. And so as we move through this, risk is becoming more of a standard benchmark and more of a process for us to be able to really assess and identify hazards and assess the probability of those hazards, and then take action in a systematic, repeatable, objective way that will impact the entire organization and not just one area.
Well, Tim, you're talking about a broad view of risk, and I think that is the view of risk that most of us need to take these days. So has that broader view of risk affected the way that we and our organizations out there assess and measure risk?
Well, it has, and it hasn't at the same time. And what I mean by that is that I think that the overall process in which we identify and mitigate risk is changed a little bit because it does take that broader look. And if you start to look at what ISO 9000 2015 standard is doing, it's really trying to enroll more people in the organization to quality. And so what that's been doing lately is allowing us to create a more broader scope of risk, and to really not just look at it from one silo, one area within the business, and actually go through the process that we have seen, where you're identifying your hazards, you're mitigating risks, and you're taking action, but doing it on a much grander scale. And so I think what a lot of companies are struggling with right now, or maybe not struggling, but they're looking towards, is where do I start? Where do I go and begin this process of risk management if I haven't already done it before? And there's a lot of ways that that ISO has been able to help with that. They've actually outlined some best practices, and also there's a lot of material out there and a lot of industry information on how risk is now becoming a stronger and more prominent dynamic within overall operations within any company, big or small.
Can you give us some examples? Just kind of getting back to my first point is where we traditionally looked at risk in terms of, let's say, product risk. I mean, are there some examples you can give where that are in other parts of the company, whether it's I don't know, supply chain or procurement, or how are people bringing in the idea of risk into these other parts of the company? If you have some examples.
Yeah, sure, definitely. So a couple good examples, one being supply chain. So you certainly have a much longer and more involved supply chain. And, one of the biggest issues, and you've seen in the news a lot, is when you have a recall or you have an issue with the product, it tends to involve a lot of supply chain issues. A lot of times when you have these types of recalls, the supplier is really where the issues were found. But ultimately, the brand owner is liable for that recall. So being able to identify risk in your supply chain is one area. Will help you to mitigate on the front end, so that way you're minimizing risk on the back end. You also look at other operational areas, so not necessarily just within the supply chain, but you look at health and safety as an example. You may look at training, you may look at financial. In some cases, a safety incident may have a high risk that could relate to potential product failure. So if you have an unsafe working condition and you are not mitigating the risk there, you could lead to production issues where you have the safety incident that causes the production line to stop. And so you really have to take a broader look at not just what's going on within the one production line or manufacturer of products, but you have to look at risk as a whole. What are all the mitigating factors that you're going to see that are going to contribute to your ultimate risk, and ultimately the bottom line, which is getting your product out, staying up with the pace of business, and make sure you keep quality and compliance at the forefront of everything you do. And that's something we're going to be talking about in the webinar next week.
Exactly. And are you seeing, in your experience or ETQ's experience, are you seeing that companies are becoming more aware of this broader concept of risk, or are most still kind of locked into a very narrow idea of it?
Well, it's funny because a lot of people are actually seeing the need for risk. They are identifying that that risk is becoming this new dynamic of benchmarking compliance. But the biggest question that we always get, and I always have is a lot of people ask, where do I start? So I know I need to do risk. I know that it's important, and I really want to start down this path, but where do I start? How do I identify all my risks? Where do I go from there? And once I have identified them, what am I doing to measure them? Is there there's some secret sauce here that I have to figure out to learn the dynamic of risk? And without giving too much away, the answer is that it's a lot simpler and more straightforward than you may imagine. There's a lot of ways that you can go about implementing a risk-based process that encompasses the whole operation, but it's not going to require you to reinvent your existing processes, but just enhance them with the proper identification, proper assessment, and the proper actioning of potential risk within your organization.
Okay, well, Tim Lozier, Director of Marketing for ETQ, thanks for joining us this morning. And like Tim said, yes, we're going to be talking about a little bit of that secret sauce that goes into making risk work for you, risk management work for you in your company. Next week at the webinar, the Risk Management Primer, getting started with risk, getting started with risk in ISO 9001 2015. That's Tuesday, next Tuesday, September 29th at 2 p.m. Eastern and 11 a.m. Pacific. Tim will be the presenter on that, our subject matter expert, and I will be there to field questions from the rather large audience that is going to be attending this webinar. So if you're interested, be sure to go out there and sign up and join us next Tuesday.
That's right.
And Tim,
All right,
thanks
guys.
for joining us. Yep.
Thank you.
See ya.
Thanks, Tim. We'll see you on Tuesday. Yeah, good webinar there coming up, Dirk. And you know that, yeah, a lot of you have already registered for that one, so make sure you get there early.
Because you may not get in.
Yeah, it's going to be a great webinar, and there'll be I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. So Tim will field your questions. If you have any questions about risk and the secret sauce of how you have to deal with risk in your organization, make sure to check that one out on Tuesday. Alrighty, well, our next article is titled "A Textbook Case of Supply Chain Mismanagement" by John Nigel. That appeared in Wednesday's issue, I believe, of Quality Digest Daily, right there, yes, on the 23rd. And you know, interesting, we're talking about risk, and this really, this article deals really with risk and how you mitigate it. Nigel is a client manager, that's his title, at InTouch Manufacturing Services. And InTouch is a US-owned and operated company that provides quality support, testing, and inspection for companies working with suppliers in Asia. So, you know, when you think about that, you know that Nigel really understands the Asian market really well, especially manufacturing. He really understands how those companies work, how US and Western companies can work with them to make sure you get what you need. Because, I mean, you know, many people look at China as being this kind of this foreign land, which it is, right? But I mean, it's like, well, they don't know what they're doing, right? I mean, they don't have the language skills, they don't really know the culture many times. So a company like InTouch really helps people do that. Come to China, you know, helps them inspect and test and measure and make sure that there's QA and, you know, in those organizations that are supplying the stuff that these US manufacturers will need. So given that as his background, he takes a look at a recent tragedy. Last month, many of us know there was an explosion, of course, at a warehouse in the city of Tianjin in China. And most of us by now have seen the shocking, absolutely shocking videos of the explosions. And those explosions leveled most of a neighborhood and killed, so far, at least 173 people. Really tragic thing. And Nigel argues that this calamity really could have and should have been prevented, or at least mitigated, had the owners are apparently were an organization, a company by the name of Ruha Logistics, was the company that owned that warehouse. So had Ruha Logistics taken the proper steps, Nigel argues that this calamity, again, really could have been prevented, or just would have been a lot less of a calamity if they had taken those proper steps. And one of the steps he's talking about there is registration to ISO 9001 was one thing that he recommended, which would have compelled the company to submit to audits that may have and probably would have uncovered some of the issues that caused the explosion. For example, this to me was shocking, the fact that the facility was storing 70 times the legal quantity of sodium cyanide in their facility at the time of the explosion. Wow. They had 70 times the legal amount of that very, very toxic chemical. And you think about that, you're like, that's crazy. How could that happen? Well, obviously, if they were an ISO 9001 registered company, there would have been an audit. An auditor would have gone in there and been shown the storage of this and said, get this the heck out of there. You got to get rid of, 69 times this amount of this stuff, right? I mean, you can't have this much sodium cyanide in your facility. And that wasn't the only violation. There's a lot of other violations that went on here. So Nigel's point is that the ISO 9001 framework, especially the focus on risk-based thinking, which Tim just talked about, so it's really a perfect transition here. Right. The focus on risk-based thinking would reduce the likelihood of this. And I think what he's saying is if you work with suppliers in China, you really should be aware of potential issues like this, and maybe you should insist on ISO 9001 registration, because if those procedures are put in place, and again, if the audits are put in place, the managers are going to understand the potential risks in their operations. You as a vendor who's working, or you as a company working with vendors and suppliers in China, will understand your risks. And you'll help them understand their risk. So maybe an ISO 9001 audit is not perfect. I mean, there's always ways of getting around these things, but it helps. And it probably, in that case, would have helped greatly to have had an ISO 9001 registration and an audit in place to prevent, or at least mitigate, that terrible tragedy.
Right, and there are parts, and John and I had talked about this, there are parts of the previous ISO 9001 standard, 2008 version and 2015 version, which do encompass the storage of materials, because that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about a warehouse, and we're talking about storage of materials. And there are parts of the standard which literally would have exactly addressed those issues. How are the chemicals stored? Are they stored within accordance of local laws and that sort of thing?
Well, do you have to have too much of it? I mean, why would you need 70 times the legal limit? I mean, I don't know.
Why would you? I mean, probably because it's a big warehouse. Oh, let's just stuff as much stuff in there as we can.
Yes,
but it would have been
illegal.
The idea is it would have been spotted.
Yeah, it would have been spotted. It would have, the audit would have said, get it the heck out of here. You can't have this here like this. I mean, skirting the rules like this is something that the Chinese, I don't want to cast aspersions, but this type of thing is the reason why people are afraid of dealing with Chinese suppliers many times and companies in China. And what John is saying here is there's ways to help mitigate that. And ISO 9001 is a good tool to use to help avoid these issues going forward.
Right.
Good article.
Actually, John's got a lot of good articles on doing business in China. If you go to his article that Mike was just talking about,
right below the player page.
Yeah, right below the player page. Link out to there. Then click on. If we can bring up that slide. Yeah. Then we don't see it on there. There's also a link on there that says Author Archive. If you click on Author Archive, it'll bring up all the articles by John Nightel. And they all have to do with doing business in China. And there's some really good information in there. That's his business, so he's got good information on how to do that. How to make it most successful and also safe.
Yeah, so many of you are doing that, so be sure to check that out. Really good information there. All right, more good information coming for you. All right, now we have our tech corner for today, and this one comes from MicroRidge. MicroRidge, we've done a few tech corners of MicroRidge in the past. This is their new mobile collect system, and Dirk is going to show it to you now. So Dirk, go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so we have talked about wireless gauging systems before, and today we're going to talk about a wireless gauging system from MicroRidge called the Mobile Collect. But before we get into their specific product, just a reminder of what wireless gauging really means. So some of you probably use handheld gauges like this. This is a caliper. You might have a micrometer. You might have other types of gauges. But one of the issues with them is very often you use a wired connector to go from your digital gauge into your laptop or data collection device in order to get the data from your digital gauge into your computer. Well, the problem with a wired gauge, and there's several, is number one, you're limited by the length. You can only go so far away, limited by the length of your cable from your gauge to your computer. You're also limited by the number of ports. A wired gauge has to go into a piece of hardware, and that hardware may have 4 ports, it may have 8 ports, but that's it. Once you've used up the number of ports, you've used up the number of gauges that you can connect in simultaneously. Wireless gauging gets away from all that. You can have hundreds of devices connected into your data collection system or your laptop. So wireless gauging makes a lot of sense. So let's take a look at MicroRidge. We've had MicroRidge on the show before. They've actually done some nice upgrades to their product line. I want to go through those. So if we go to the gauge cam here, their old transmitter, the transmitter is what connects to your gauge. That's over on this side here. You can see that's much larger than their new one. Their new one is about 75% smaller than their older transmitter. And the nice thing about that is it fits very nice in behind a small gauge. So this is like this is a 6-inch Mitutoyo caliper. And you can see it just tucks very nicely in behind the gauge, so it's out of your way. Obviously, you got your connecting cable comes out of the top, goes into the transmitter. But the real change really is if we go and look at the receiver. This is the old MicroRidge Mobile Collect USB base. There would have been a USB cable that runs from the base into the laptop, and this would be your receiver. This is the new receiver. This is the micro base. You can see it's about the size of a USB thumb drive. It's about a quarter of the size of the old USB base, which means that if you're using a laptop, you don't have this big box with a cable connected to it that you have to do something with. You've just got your little dongle plugged in there and you're good to go. Now, they do still sell, by the way, they do still sell the Mobile Collect USB base, and the reason for that is some people may need this little option that's on there, which is a switched input. So if you need to trigger data collection from maybe a foot switch or a mechanical switch that's on a fixture or something like that, you would still want this because this allows you to trigger your data measurement from a switch. If you don't need that, actually the smaller one just makes a lot more sense, much more compact, and they cost the same price, so it doesn't really matter. Okay, so let's see how you'd use this. So if we go to our screen capture here, what we're going to see here, and let me close out one of my other programs. Okay. This is called the Express Setup, and this software comes with the MicroRidge product. First thing we're going to do is we're going to say find base. And all this is doing is looking for a receiver that's plugged into the laptop, and then is also connecting to it and then displaying what devices have been associated with that receiver. Now I've got two devices associated with it. I have a caliper associated and a micrometer associated. All that means is that this is set up to recognize input from these two devices. I could have hundreds of devices connected into this receiver. So that's one of the, like I said, one of the advantages of this type of system. Now, I'm going to enable communications just so I can test it. So I'm going to click the data collection on the data collection button on my caliper. And each time I click the button, as I click the button, I'm collecting data into the Mobile Collect. So this is really just testing that the data is coming. I can see it. On the left-hand side, we can see here with my mouse, it's telling me what this is. This is the caliper. This was a label I gave it. And this is the actual measurement coming in from the caliper. So now I know that I've got everything set up, ready to go. It's collecting data. Now, how are we going to use it? Well, this comes with another piece of software called WedgeLink. And I'll just open up that. Don't need to see all my email there. WedgeLink operates like a keyboard. It mimics a keyboard. So what WedgeLink does, it allows me to take the data from my Mobile Collect system and input it into any piece of software you have. So whether you have, let's say, your favorite SBC software, you have your gauge calibration software, or as we'll see here, I'm just using Excel. All this does, it mimics a keyboard, so you can connect any kind of software into this. It doesn't matter. So I'm going to load my little configuration file. I've set up certain parameters that I want to use. So WedgeLink is running, and I just have Excel open here. So every time now I collect data, it's auto-populating Excel. And we can see, if we go back to our screenshot here, I've collected date, time, the name of the device, the label on the device, which is caliper, and of course, my reading. Now, the first three are optional. I have chosen to collect date, time, and label of the device. I don't have to do that. I could collect just the data if I wanted, but it makes a lot of sense to do this, particularly if you're bringing it into SPC software. You probably want a date and time stamp to know when it was collected, and you might want to know the type of the device. Particularly if you're using a lot of different devices, some software have the capability to sort the data as it's coming in by label. So you could be collecting data from a number of different devices, and your software, if it's small enough, would recognize, oh, this is coming from the caliber, put it over here. This is coming from a micrometer, put it over there. This is coming from an LVDT, put it over there. So one of the issues that comes up very often when we're talking about wireless gauging, and why a lot of people in the past have shied away from it, is the question of, if I work in a really noisy RF environment, is wireless gauging going to work? And the issues there that a lot of people are aware of is EMF. This is just noise coming off of mechanical equipment, electronic equipment. And also it's simply, there's a lot more Wi-Fi devices, there's a lot more devices out there, Bluetooth and so forth, that are transmitting on RF frequencies. I mean, in the world we live in now, everything is wireless. So is there going to be interference? Is there going to be something that's going to block my gauge from being able to communicate from the transmitter to the receiver? So MicroRidge has offered a couple different things that help solve this. And we'll go back to our screen share here. first of all, they have something called an RF sniffer. And all this does is oops, I got to close my other software. All the RF sniffer does is it goes through, and we can see here, it's scanning through all of the frequencies that MicroRidge uses on their transmitter. And it's looking to see, are these frequencies busy? Is there anything that's putting noise or a lot of transmission that would make a particular channel that they use not a wise channel to use? And we see on the left, there's a couple areas here, channel 17 and 18, that we might not want to use. The rest are green. MicroRidge is saying, hey, that's fine. By default, MicroRidge uses what they call their channel 21 on their devices. We can see it looks fine here. If that had been really busy, if I was worried about it, I would simply go into the express setup that I showed you just a minute ago and simply tell the base to operate on a different channel, and that would take care of the problem. Now, the other thing that they do, and this is really clever, is that the data transmission part is just milliseconds. In other words, there isn't a need for them to maintain a continuous link between the transmitter and the receiver. Every time you tell it to collect data, the transmitter comes on, sends data for a few milliseconds, that's it, and turns off. So that transmission only has to punch through to the receiver for a couple milliseconds. And even in a noisy environment, that's going to be something that is most likely not going to be a problem. Even if it does encounter a problem, it'll try again if it can't get through the first time. So there's a lot of both hardware and software tools at your disposal that are going to make sure that even in a noisy RF environment, this is going to work. Okay, so what kind of gauges can this work with? Well, that's the great thing. This happens to be Mitutoyo. MicroRidge has a bunch of different cables that they sell. The cable is simply a cable that goes from your device to your transmitter. And they've got cables for Brown & Sharp, Onosoki, Silvac, Mitutoyo, you name it, they most likely have a cable that is going to work for your particular gauges. And in fact, they've got a little, I've included a link for it in the player page down there. They've got a little page on their website that allows you to choose which cables you need for your particular application, your particular gauge, so you can check that out. So, total cost. This is pretty darn cheap. We're talking for the transmitter and for a receiver, whichever one. They have several different receivers. I've shown you two here. And the cable that matches your particular gauge, $743. So a complete kit, transmitter, receiver, and connecting cable, $743. And you're ready to go with wireless gauging. So if you're more interested in this, if you follow the link underneath the player page, there's two links. One just takes you out to the MicroRidge site. The other one takes you out to the selection page to help you select which cables and which transmitters, receivers, and so forth work for you. So check that out. So once again, thanks to the folks at MicroRidge for sending us a set of their Mobile Collect wireless gauging tools. Thanks, guys.
Yes, and there you go. Again, that is MicroRidge, and that's Dirk doing our Tech Corner for this week with the MicroRidge Mobile Collect. Good job there, Dirk. Really nice
yeah,
stuff.
We've had them on before, and they have made some real nice improvements to the equipment there. So
no doubt, no doubt. Well, that's our show. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Tim Lozier of ETQ, for joining us. And as a reminder, of course, we have a great webinar with Tim coming up, Tim and Dirk.
Yep.
That is this Tuesday, September 29th. At 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. That's our normal time where we do all of our webinars. So make sure you check that one out if you want to learn about risk. Really going to be a good webinar there. Thank you as well to, of course, to MicroRidge, again, as we said, for providing us with a great Tech Corner this week. So that's our show. So you all have a great weekend. Thank you again for being here with us. We'll see you next week, next Monday for QDD, and next Friday right back here for another QDL.
that's right.
We'll see you. Have a great weekend.
So long.
Bye.